Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Eitan Kresolevsky. I'm with the Forest Stewards Guild. I'm sitting here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Thank you all for registering and being on here. Um, I'm excited for the next hour or so, where we have Neil Chapman with uh, who's sitting in Flagstaff right now. And so just to get everyone situated, welcome to Zoom. It's a familiar place for many of us. Um, we're gonna go through a brief introduction of the Forest Stewards Guild in case folks don't know who we are. And then I'm going to introduce Neil, and then Neil's going to share a presentation with us about the Wildland Fire Commission. And then we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A and for some dialogue. If questions come up during the presentation, use the chat function. We have Rachel Bean with the Forest Stewards Guild also on, and she's going to be a person if you need any help on Zoom. Her Zoom avatar is just called Forest Stewards Guild. So if you need to direct message someone, it's Forest Stewards Guild. Okay, so with that, I'll also add that please, keep your mic muted so we don't have any background noise during the presentation. And then when we get to the Q&A, we can, we can use the hand feature or unmute and have some good dialogue. I'll also say that we're recording this, I think Zoom alerted everyone, so you're aware. And so with that, I'll jump into just a few slides about the Forest Stewards Guild. So the Forest Stewards Guild is hosting this call, and we're a national nonprofit devoted to forestry that is ecologically, economically, and socially responsible. And that is a really broad mission. And so that means different things in different places. This great country is a lot of diversity in our forests. And so a lot of different systems, a lot of different ecologies. So we do a lot of different things. I'm just going to touch on a few here. One of the things that we do is work to train and encourage the next generation of leaders. This photo is from some high school youth collecting forest inventory data on the Cibola National Forest in New Mexico. So a lot of connections with youth and young adults. The Guild also works on the ground to reintroduce fire to fire-adapted ecosystems. We're primarily doing that in the Southwest, in the Southeast, and in the Northeast. And then we also work closely with forest-based communities. So this photo here may look like it's in the back 40, but it's actually, there's homes, within 300 yards of where this person's putting the torch down. So we work closely with communities. And then climate change, it's the existential crisis of our time, and across all our programs and with our members, we work to figure out ways to address climate change challenges. Finally, we conduct and share research, and then we also value rigorous place-based science and also experiences to decide management decisions, to guide management decisions. So it's a little bit about the Guild and then how we do it. We're a small organization, so we do it through collaboration, partnerships, and that's kind of our bread and butter. We work with a lot of different federal agencies, tribes, states, other nonprofits, and communities across the country. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to see if I can make this work. Great. So I'm going to introduce Neil. So Neil Chapman lives in Flagstaff, Arizona, with his wife, Jennifer, and son, Joseph. He grew up in South Hadley, Massachusetts, a small Western Massachusetts town along the Connecticut River. He headed west for college, receiving a bachelor's in science from Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Neil has devoted 20 years to wildland fire and forestry and worked around the country. He worked for the Nature Conservancy, starting as a preserve manager, and then moved into managing fuels partnerships on public lands with a lot of thinning and stewardship projects across tens of thousands of acres. In 2019, he became a wildland fire captain for the Flagstaff Fire Department and the Summit Fire and Medical District. And he leads the forest health prevention and preparedness and mitigation function of the department. He also manages the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project and is involved in collaborative efforts in the Forest Restoration Initiative and the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. In 2022, Neil received federal appointments to the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission, and that's what we're all here today to learn about. And as well as a federal appointment to the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program Advisory Committee, a national advisory committee. So with that, I'm really excited to have Neil on board right now. So Neil, I'm gonna mute my mic, and I look forward to learning about the Wildland Fire Management Commission.
Thank you, Eitan. That was wonderful, and thanks everyone for being here. I see a lot of friendly names on Zoomland here, so thanks for folks for making some time today to learn about the Wildfire Commission. So, as you just heard, I'm a wildland fire captain. Our Flagstaff Fire Department and Summit Fire District are basically one program, so we get to cover both the city of Flagstaff and some rural areas outside of the city. As far as our direct response and responsibilities for management. But we do work with partners across a great scale out here. We have really engaged community. We show up for fires with the forest, and they show up on our fires in the city and the district. It's really well integrated here in Flagstaff. So if anybody has questions about kind of not what I'm going to get into today at all, but just sort of our mutual aid network of partners, let me know, and I'm happy to make some time. We can chat about that. And then also, I just wanted to recognize Nathan Miller with the Santa Fe Fire Department, who's on the phone with us or on the call with us today. Nathan was also a commission member and is the superintendent of the Wildland Division in Santa Fe. And if there's there's probably a lot of folks here from New Mexico, and if there's opportunities for Nathan to clarify anything that I'm talking about that is more easily translated by a local friend and commission member, then Nathan, please jump in as appropriate. So you've got two commission members on the meeting today. All right, so let me jump into some slides. Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. So one of the things that we learned a bunch through this process was, and being relatively new to kind of the structure fire department world, I'd spent many years with the Nature Conservancy before jumping over here almost 5 years ago now. Well, in the 1970s, there was a transformational report called America Burning. So this was a report that was created by a statute, and Congress got some folks together. This was actually 50 years ago last year that this came together. At the time, they were really addressing structure fire issues. There was a lot of urban fires, firefighters getting hurt, people dying in fires. This was the era of a lot of people smoking indoors and before fire retardants and everything. And so this report really was a watershed moment in the history of the fire service and fire safety and prevention. It highlighted a need for new, comprehensive, and coordinated approaches. And it created the U.S. Fire Administration. It created some expectations around smoke detectors. It really was a game changer. And so early in the Wildfire Commission process, we used this effort as kind of a baseline of how we can go about doing a similar thing, not in structure fire, but still in the concept of a commission working to solve challenges. And so this really was kind of our vision moving forward. And so this report had a couple different types of recommendations, what we think of as actionable. And so those are things that we can basically do without a whole lot of heavy lifting. It had some recommendations that we would clarify as providing direction. So kind of thinking, instead of giving like a point A to point B map, it's more of a compass on how we want to get somewhere. And then there were some transformational recommendations that are really heavy lifts. So of the 100 recommendations in America Burning, 2 of them were classified as transformational. And we wanted to kind of stay within that format. We didn't want to come up with 100 transformational recommendations in our report with limited capacity to make those changes. So one of the big transformational recommendations in America Burning was the creation of the U.S. Fire Administration. And there's some language in this report actually about the U.S. Fire Administration and wildland fire management that at the time when we read it now, the language used back then was kind of, very odd. But where we are now, we're still dealing with some of the similar challenges and how to integrate the structure and medical services into this wildland fire world. So we'll get into the fire administration later into the presentation. But what we're going to talk about today, we're going to kind of define the crisis, get into the commission background, some of our processes, our themes and recommendations, how the report is organized, and the next steps we're taking. So defining the crisis, I'm sure this is a pretty familiar concept here with the audience in this space, but here's a picture from just north of Flagstaff, a little cinder cone called Walker Lake. We love to call things lakes here in Arizona that really don't have water. And so there's a photo on top from the late 1800s and a photo on the bottom there is the same spot 100 years later. So that photo on top is a perfect example of what the Ponderosa pine forest looked like for over 10,000 years. Very open canopy, trees in groups and interspaces, individual trees, kind of that clumpy structure with individuals. Obviously, even on a red flag day, a fire is not going to be able to run through that canopy. We're down below, we're already seeing evidences of high severity fire taking out stands of trees. And you can see some of the trees creeping into the meadow. And so if nothing happens, over hundreds of years, we'll completely lose that meadow. It'll fill in with trees. So setting the stage kind of for the crisis that we're dealing with. And then the fire return interval in this landscape, we're pretty familiar with this. This is proven science. We've got these amazing folks all over the country studying this stuff. The trees or the tree rings and the fire scars associated with those tree rings are well studied. We have this report. This goes back quite a few years, but it's taken from just north of Flagstaff, literally just outside city limits, and we see a 1540 to 1876 time span showing a fire return interval of 4.9 years. So I very often hear us kind of trying to be conservative and maybe not scare people with fire return interval frequency numbers, and we'll say things like, 2 to 12 years or 2 to 15 years, and it's like, it's a lot more like 2 to 5 years. And so the frequency of the fires, especially in our area of northern Arizona, were just incredible. And so this is some of the crisis that we're dealing with here. We've got over 100 years of fire deficit with a 5-year return interval in a lot of these places. So defining the crisis, a little context on kind of what we're dealing with here. We're looking at lots more communities being threatened by wildfire as communities are expanding out into the wildland urban interface than were previous. Some of the numbers we're seeing in the lower 48, we're seeing 9% of the land area defined as wildland urban interface, but that's 39% of the homes. There's over 45 million homes designated as at risk in the WUI. So, we actually, well, unfortunately had the ability to integrate lessons learned from Lahaina before this report was finished. Marshall Fire after action reviews, all the information we've received from Paradise and the campfire. So we're really, this is a very modern report, up to the minute data and ability to reference things that we're seeing when this report was finalized in September of last year. And also thinking about the changing face of wildfire, this isn't just a Western problem. This risk exists across the country. Historically, we've seen catastrophic fires taking out entire communities in the upper Midwest. We had fires last summer in the Northeast. I believe I saw some Nature Conservancy colleagues reporting out a fire on a nature preserve in Rhode Island. And one of the spooky numbers that I remember pulling out of some of this, 72% of the land area in Connecticut is classified as wildland urban interface. So while a lot of the news stories come out about the catastrophes and impacts we're seeing out west, this certainly is not limited to the West in our risk or in our thinking as we work through this report. So the commission background. 50 members from diverse geographies and backgrounds. So there was over 500 applicants, 50 people selected for it. We had 14 federal members and the 36 other members. And so that was split up among state, NGOs, county, municipal, people specifically from the fire service workforce. My appointment was to represent municipal level government. Nathan was appointed to represent the workforce itself. Really diverse group of folks. I mean, we basically had timber interests, ranching interests, conservation interests. We had people with specific backgrounds in post-fire flood mitigation. Just an amazing diversity of folks. And that last line down there, nonpartisan, it really was amazing because there certainly was times where you could, probably just pick people out and make some assumptions about their political alignments, and that never once got in the way of anything we were working on. So whether it was, a rancher from southeastern Oregon or a conservation rep from Southern California, there was never a moment that any of our conversations ventured into an area that wasn't productive. So it was established by the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we were tasked by Congress to come up with a couple things. We actually wrote 2 reports. There was a first one on aviation resource management that was released about a year ago now, and then the full report that was released last September. So again, you can find a full list of commission members on the website where you can download the report, and we can put that in the chat later when it's complete. You just Google Wildland Fire Commission, you'll find it. But there is a full list of all the commission members, and if you need contact info for anybody specifically that you would like to reach out to, please let me know. So as the process started in September of 2022, we realized we needed to create a framework. We have to go after this strategically. So we said we're going to divide up into work groups, and then people will volunteer for work groups. There was 2 coordinators and 4 additional staffers supporting this effort. So a total of 6 staffers, but really the coordinators, Tyson Bertoni Riggs and Annie Schmidt, were the leaders of this effort. And you probably know some of them. They've been working in conservation for many, many years. They were just absolutely amazing. I can't say enough about how much they did to pull this together in the time period that we had. So these were the work groups. I chaired the response coordination, and I was part of the workforce and landscapes groups. So if you have questions about some of these other groups, I am more than happy to put you in touch with the folks that were much more significantly involved in those efforts. So the work groups are not how the report's organized. We'll get into that a little bit, but this is how we framed our discussions. So each work group came up with findings. Basically, we identified what are the problems in this work group space, and then we got into what are the recommendations to go after these findings, to go after these challenges. And so each one of these groups had a minimum of about 6 weeks to get together. And although we had a year to put this report together, I guarantee you every single one of these groups ran out of time. It was difficult. There's just so much going on in this space that, for example, the response coordination group or the workforce group or the landscapes group, I mean, after 6 to 10 weeks of at minimum 2 hours a week of meetings and all the behind the scenes work from the coordinators and staffers, we were scrambling at the end to put everything together. So although it sounds like we had plenty of time, we had a year, we didn't have plenty of time, but we all agreed that we needed to get this thing done on time the best we can. So there's some topics that I don't want to call it a punt, but there were some things where we'll get into a recommendation or two where we recommend moving this into a additional review space, whether it's a task force gets created or another group takes on some of these ideas. There were some things that we just didn't have time to fully dive into. For example, the ordering system, how a firefighter from Tucson ends up, on a truck in northern Montana is a pretty complicated system. And the tweaks we want to make in there are not easy to get into and involve things that are greatly outside the purview of Congress. And since our statute said our audience for this report was Congress, there were certain things in there that we kind of had to leave some breadcrumb trails for other folks to follow. So our process, we did engage outside opinions. So there was a public comment portal Over 500 submissions came in. The staffers reviewed those and would give us key themes. So we didn't directly have to read every single one. We weren't expected to as members, but any major common themes or any submissions of note were given to us direct. We also had tons of meetings online with and in person with subject matter experts. So people who may not directly have been appointed as commission members, but were certainly experts in their field, were brought in to lead a lot of discussions. For example, talking about pods or air quality impacts or certain workforce issues. We had some different union reps come in and federal agency reps come in and talk about issues. Panel discussions. It was a diverse group of folks that we, in a wonderful way, we had amazing people make themselves available. So when the Wildfire Commission group said, "Hey, we want to talk about this, and we know you guys are the experts," people were available to come in and give us presentations and be part of it. And so the commission itself sort of grew over time. We're still those 50 members were the voting members, but we did end up bringing in some really key folks that we said they need to be in the space as much as possible to help guide this process. So summary, we have 148 recommendations. We had hoped for 100. We probably came close to almost 300 at some point and figured out how to get close to the middle there. So 148. And the big takeaway here for everyone I want you to realize is this consensus process. So each work group would come up with recommendations, and then that work group, we would vote on it. So we had, I love it, I can live with it, or I can't. And we would vote on every recommendation, and any recommendation that had one person who could not feel comfortable moving that forward, we would stop the process. We would find a way forward if there was, and if there wasn't, we would drop the recommendation. So every recommendation that came out of the work group had full work group consensus, and then it would go to the entire commission and we would vote again. And so every commission member fully supported every single recommendation in this effort. So there were some really interesting topics that didn't make it to consensus that we could totally have a whole nother presentation on. But the power of this report really is, as you read this, that entire group of 50 people agreed to move every single one of these recommendations forward with nobody blocking any of these. So a lot of strength and power behind those recommendations. And of course, we always are told no single recommendation or sentence should be considered alone. But most of the time when we're in small groups of people, they say, what are your top 5? What are your top 10? So we all have things that impact us a little more than others, or ideas that we think are more powerful. But at the same time, we don't see significant change occurring across this space without the majority of these recommendations being acted upon. So themes and recommendations. As I said, the report's not organized by the work groups, and it's not organized by themes, but these are the things that we saw throughout every single process of this, throughout all the work groups. Another theme that's not really represented in this slide, but was really powerful through this report was the representation of Indigenous cultural burning practices. And so Bill Tripp from Northern California was just amazing as a commission member supporting this process. And we quickly realized, I think it was through the landscapes group, that recognizing some of these tribal programs, tribal sovereignty, Indigenous cultural burning, really is relevant for every single work group that had that we created. And there was no way to just put that into one group. So a tribal ad hoc group was created that basically followed the entire year-long process and made sure that every one of the work groups was getting the appropriate tribal recommendation support as they moved forward. But enabling beneficial fire, I think, was a big one. Just the ability to kind of recognize what we mean when we say beneficial fire. I'll get into that in another slide, but just pushing that concept first. So as we talk about every component of this report, it's all based on, we all agreed, even the EPA folks in the room, that enabling beneficial fire was really the key to moving this forward. And then again, workforce. We kind of divided workforce between federal and non-federal. There's still an ongoing crisis around support of our federal workforce, giving them the right pay, the right benefits, the right work-life balance. I don't think the answer to our federal workforce is everybody should be a year-round employee, and I think we're struggling with that. There's folks that need to go out there and be heroes for 6 months, and then do something else for 6 months, because you can't do that kind of pace full time year round. We already have mental health issues with a lot of our workforce, and forcing them to accept these year round positions and do the same thing they're doing for the existing 6 months is not a recipe for success. Collaboration is something that goes through this whole process, really making sure, and I'm sure people who are in a Forest Stewards Guild advertised event are pretty familiar with collaboration, but that's not the case with everybody. And so that was another overarching theme that really had a lot of priority. So report organization. And so one thing I want you to take away from the slide is it's a big, heavy report. It's 300 plus pages, 148 recommendations. Please don't be scared of reading the report. It's it's not as bad as it sounds. There's a large bibliography in the back. There's a large section of basically repeating the recommendations without the narratives, but the executive summary and then the narratives themselves of each recommendation is a little more than half of the report. And the way it's organized, and I think this is kind of how we came up as a group, again, a consensus agreement, is basically the fire cycle. We've got a list of recommendations based on what we need to have happening before a fire ever starts. Then we have a list of recommendations around what we do during a fire and our response. And then we get into after the fire. And then there's a section at the end around governance and kind of frameworks. And so it's I think very easy to get into a report. I mean, as I said, please don't be scared. It's heavy. If you print it out, there's a lot, 300 plus pages, but it's organized in a way that it reads fast. There's a lot of big pictures and big text in there. So please be comfortable and don't get as intimidated as it could be. And again, that's a takeaway, I think, of this presentation, is we want folks to feel comfortable diving into this thing and not overwhelmed. So a couple themes to talk about: enabling beneficial fire. We, even in the commission space, we kind of had to walk some folks through what this means, and very early in the process, we defined beneficial fire as prescribed burning, indigenous cultural burning, and wildfires managed for resource objectives. I don't think there was little to no controversy around prescribed burning, little to no controversy around cultural burning. But what that meant, and we basically had to pause in an early meeting and say this, is we're not saying cultural burning on tribal lands. We're saying cultural burning on all lands. So what is the process for a tribe to go to, say, the Forest Service or the BLM and say, these are our ancestral lands, and we want to restore some of these cultural burning practices on other people's lands, and really recognizing the importance of that without associating a pace and scale. And so I think it's a really popular topic these days. It's a lot of people get behind it and support it, and it's easy to kind of say we need more cultural burning. And it's like, yeah, I try not to say we need more. I try to say I would like more, because it's not up to me as the fire department employee to dictate terms of how a tribe wants to engage in indigenous cultural burning, or how a group of folks that may not be a federally recognized tribe engage in cultural burning. It's up to those folks. And so I think we really balanced in this report, recognizing that as a right without associating an expectation with it, where I think it's really easy to say, oh, well, if we're going to solve the wildfire crisis by doing a couple things, including scaling up cultural burning. And I, as I said, I don't think it's appropriate to dictate terms of expectations on others in that space. And then wildfire managed for resource objectives was something we also had to pause a little early on, and especially those of us in the Southwest kind of recognize this as a tool a lot more than other regions of the country. But I've been on plenty of wildfires where at the end of the day, there was more acres that benefited than were harmed. And we have plenty of fires where the entire intent of that operation is beneficial fire. And the reality is the sense of urgency that exists in every fire management realm of our country is based on, we need to put out this fire. It's an emergency. When we apply that sense of urgency for our resource ordering, for our collaborations, for our support of the workforce, and we take that sense of urgency and we don't just use it to stop a negative event, but we use it to enable a positive event, really cool things start to happen. We've had wonderful wildfires in this area around Flagstaff that were both officially designated as a quote resource benefit fire. We've had some fires that nobody ever mentioned the term resource benefit. An example would be the Raphael fire, burned southwest of Flagstaff a couple years ago, almost 80,000 acres. Less than 10% of that was high severity, and it was mostly in the canyons in between Flagstaff and Sedona, where on these steep slopes, we don't really have the ability to dictate terms of fire behavior very well. So we had, 80,000 acre fire, something like 8% high severity. It wasn't labeled as a beneficial wildfire, but when you look at the maps and you see the actual fire effects, it was an incredibly beneficial wildfire for creating a huge buffer southwest of Flagstaff. So enabling beneficial fire was something that is key throughout this entire report, and those are the three components so in the report when you see that term beneficial fire, that's what we're talking about. And so some of the selected recommendations around how we enable beneficial fire. Congress should instruct agencies to develop necessary administrative systems to allow resource ordering. And so basically this is a fancy way of saying mobilize the same way we do for wildfires for prescribed fires. So, it's really easy for the Forest Service to pay Flagstaff Fire Department to load up in a Type 3 engine and drive to California. They don't do any of that for prescribed burning. And it's not that they can't. They just don't have the systems in place. And so, for example, it's kind of, simplifying it, but Forest Service Chief Randy Moore pays us to go to California when there's a big incident. The district and our district ranger, Matt McGrath, would be required to pay us to go help them on a prescribed fire. The district does not have a budget to pay us to do that sort of work in a significant way compared to Randy Moore's national suppression budget. So figuring out these systems to allow us to be paid to support prescribed fire at the local level involves both federal budgeting. It involves working with the state who oversees the dispatch center and deals with reimbursements. But when we're looking at a workforce, especially in places like Arizona and New Mexico, where we see so many municipal departments having wildland fire response and prescribed fire capacity, it seems like a no-brainer. We can help work on all lands, all hands by plugging in these folks. I see you coming in, Nathan. Do you have something to add there? You're still muted. Okay, I'll keep moving. Jump in when you can. We'll let you unmute. Oh, let me see if I can do it from here. No. We'll jump into the chat, please, and give able to now.
There we go.
Yeah, there you go. What do you got?
No, so I was just going to say on our behalf here at the Santa Fe National Forest, we're able to actually work with the Forest Service and bill back. As part of this whole process that was implemented by the Biden administration, allowed for at least our district to get some money that we're able to bill back and work in conjunction with the Forest Service for all their prescribed burning. So
yeah, you guys have done some super cool things there. I think Porfirio at some point shared some agreements that you guys put in place. But we don't have that here. We're working on it. So we're trying to steal your thunder.
I can share my contract if you want to help you guys out with it. So
thank you. And then recommendation 41. This was another big deal. And this is a subtle thing that I love talking to groups about. Some of the negotiations that took place in the commission space. So we had EPA folks in the room. We had public health experts in the room. And we would have this discussion where people would say there is no such thing as beneficial smoke. And then for a handful of us, we're kind of going, well, hey, we're saying beneficial fire an awful lot, and you can't have fire without smoke. So what are we talking about here? How can there be no beneficial smoke? And it's like, well, we recognize that there really isn't a benefit if you're a human being and you're breathing in smoke in that way. But there's a trade-off here. It's not something where the answer is, no smoke ever. We know there's going to be smoke impacts one way or another. What kind of smoke impacts are we able to create for our communities? Do we want to create low intensity, low duration events, or do we want to never have those and create high intensity, high duration events? And so in this little tiny narrative here, our huge victory was that first line. So while enabling proactive use of beneficial fire, Congress should blah, blah, blah. That was the victory. we wanted to preface this entire concept of recognizing that we as fire advocates need to be better at mitigating smoke impacts to our communities, recognizing that this is under the reality that we need to have more beneficial fire on the landscape. So the original draft of that recommendation didn't even reference beneficial fire. We fought hard to get it in there, and then they threw it in at the end. And we fought a little harder, and we got it at the start. And so that's a big victory. And you know, there's been some changes with some air quality rules recently. The EPA is making some proposals to I think I'm not the expert in this, but lower the kind of attainment levels or the PM 2.5 levels, the where you start with to be in compliance, and that could negatively impact the ability for some areas to get prescribed fire on the ground. But they're trying to create an easier way to get exemptions. So even if your area is not in compliance based on these new standards, it's going to be easier for prescribed burn programs to be able to go through that exemption process and get the green light to do these risk reduction burns. And then another great one as we think about beneficial fire, federal land management targets. You know, there's a driver there to go do big things. So, you know, the feds, we're giving you money to treat a bunch of acres. Well, there's a lot of acres around our communities that are really complex acres and not a lot of acres. So the reality is we don't want to drive people out into the middle of nowhere to go crank out 5,000 acre burns that are great for the watershed, that are great for the landscape, but do nothing to protect our communities. And we don't want them to come in and protect our communities at the expense of some elected official thinking they're not doing the right thing because they just treated 500 acres instead of 5,000 acres. So what we would like to do is figure out a target system that can recognize both. So, you know, we still want them to go out and do the 5,000 acre burn and protect the watersheds and the landscapes, but we also want them to come into my backyard and do the 500 acre burn that might take 5 years of planning and thousands of personal interactions to get the public to agree to this, and make sure that that effort is recognized in a way that's equal to a 5,000 acre burn. So we don't have the answer on how we do that yet, but you know, this is where we're really talking about like resilience metrics versus just acres treated. So workforce, that was such an exciting group to be in right now to think about all these challenges. And again, we split it up between federal and non-federal, but really the intent here is a comprehensive, expanded, and sustainable workforce is a cornerstone of our ability to change. So these loss systems, you know, these loss sequences of catastrophic fires burning across the landscape, slamming into our communities, we cannot break that sequence without the right workforce. And a lot of that isn't necessarily people in trucks or with tools. It's people working in the communities, in people's driveways, talking about fire risk reduction, firewise concepts. So the workforce throughout this report, please don't just think about it as people in green pants. There's a lot more to this than the actual responders. But as we're seeing, you know, again, the issues in the federal workforce probably aren't surprising to anybody on this call. Some Forest Service districts are struggling to staff engines. The workforce we're getting are very often younger and less experienced, which then goes into some of the realities around our ability to implement prescribed burns or beneficial wildfires if we don't have the ability to manage these delicate firing operations when they're needed. Then it doesn't really matter if we've got the social license to do it if we don't have the right people to do it. So also a trained workforce is a big part of this. And so something that I think I really got excited about in the dialogue of this report, we need to better integrate both what we think of as like our traditional suppression workforce and our prescribed fire workforce. So we've got some amazing groups out there like Forest Stewards Guild, Ember Alliance, Nature Conservancy, Mount Adams Resource Stewards, just some of these wonderful groups that are really focusing on beneficial fire. And then we've got kind of our traditional workforce around suppression, and we need to get them together in an easier way. And some of these ordering systems or agreements through the feds are unnecessary bottlenecks in better integrating these two skill sets. So we need, you know, contract crews that are usually just out there digging line to get better at prescribed burning, and we need prescribed fire folks to get better access to some of the suppression skills that are needed to climb the the National Wildland Coordinating Group skills within things like burn boss, firing boss, engine boss. All these things require a mix of suppression and prescribed fire. And so we don't want to silo our workforces any more than we already are. We really want to integrate everybody as much as possible. We also talked about time to competency. Somebody brought up a statistic that you can become a brain surgeon, or you can go fly a $100 million Air Force fighter jet in a time that's quicker than becoming a prescribed fire burn boss. And so we're not trying to say we want less qualified or skilled people out there, but what are the ways we can accelerate their training and their skills to make sure that we're not short of these really important qualifications. So another selected recommendation that I think has great impact through this is getting back to the U.S. Fire Administration. So again, I wasn't as familiar with this organization before we started diving into this report, but Dr. Lori Moore Merrill, the head of the Fire Administration, was one of our co-chairs of this commission, along with Joan Mooney from Interior and Merrill Harrell from Department of Agriculture. And so the more I started learning about U.S. Fire Administration, this is a group that is well positioned if the feds make a commitment to scale up their capacity to really promote fire adapted communities from the inside out. So the Fire Administration is basically tasked with providing national level support to our structure and EMS service providers. They are in the wildland fire space, but they are very often overwhelmed by the land management style agencies. So the ability for the Fire Administration to come in and dictate terms with things like qualifications or ordering or resource distribution, it's not that they can't, but historically they just don't. And we leave that up to big guys like the Forest Service or, the federal agencies. That needs to change, because as we get into another slide here about what our actual national workforce looks like, the Fire Administration is well positioned to dictate some terms here. So these are our fluid numbers, of course, but we're looking at about 19,000 dedicated firefighters within the federal government. We're looking at about 24,000 private contractors. So there's already more private contractors than feds out there. Now, I don't want to discredit the federal firefighters that we have. The hotshot crews, the 110 or so hotshot crews across this country are and then our, the occasional smoke jumper base. I mean, these are the most elite, well-trained firefighters in our workforce, but they are not the majority of our workforce. And so then we've got private contractors. And then when we look at the FEMA stats for local fire departments and districts, we're seeing 1.2 million people across the country that are in FEMA as a fire response organization at the local level. Now, the majority of these people are trained in structure fire and EMS, but it was really pretty powerful when we got some of these FEMA stats. 63% of the fire departments registered with FEMA have reported needing to respond to wildfires. Now, obviously, the majority of our big fire departments in municipal areas like, Phoenix and New York City and some of these big areas really aren't necessarily responding to the wildland urban interface. But I mean, we're looking at a significant number of 1.2 million people having the need to have some sort of leadership training and preparing them in responding to wildfires, and needing to recognize that if they want to, really fulfill their oath of protecting and supporting our communities, they need to think of a level of service that includes supporting beneficial fire. So whether that's engaging in prescribed fire, engaging in supporting the management of wildfires, getting more involved in FireWise efforts within their community. This really is the horsepower of our national workforce. Right there is our local fire departments and districts, whether they're career, combination, or volunteers, and then as well as state agency fire management. So I see that in the chat. I'll just get there real quick. We struggle to get reliable numbers on state agencies. I know CAL FIRE alone has over 8,000 people. But the way states often roster groups like fire departments, we're considered a cooperator. We got some numbers out of some states where we weren't sure if that was actually state employees or they were taking a bunch of their contractors and cooperators and kind of counting them as a state asset. Because technically when we go out on wildfires under a resource order, even though I'm the Flagstaff Fire Department, we are basically a state resource through the ordering and the agreement system. And then nonprofit workforce numbers are not huge. It's growing. Again, groups like Forest Stewards Guild and some of these other networks are probably less than 1,500 people nationally. but man, do they play an oversized role in advocacy and really pushing for beneficial fire across what we would think of as the all lands, all hands approach. So again, that's a really important component of the workforce that we want to integrate into the big picture, even though it's not, I mean, you'll have more people on a type 1 fire in one place than potentially all of the NGO qualified folks across the country. But man, are they powerful in their all hands, all lands advocacy. And then a couple more recommendations around workforce, really the resource ordering, making it easier for non-traditional folks to plug in. We have national examples where things are going really well, other areas where there's some challenges. We should get together, and one group that's lined up really well to deal with some of these challenges is the National Association of State Foresters. And so we're looking at the NASF is taking a role in some of this. I'll get into that in a little bit. Increasing access to qualifications and training opportunities. So again, I said that time to competency for a prescribed fire burn boss takes an awful long time for somebody whose day job is full-time fire response, going out on wildfires all summer, doing prescribed fire in the shoulder seasons. It's even harder for folks who aren't doing that full-time. So if you're out in the communities doing a lot of the advocacy work, and you're not necessarily first in line for these training opportunities, we've got to make some changes there. And so, for example, the Prescribed Fire Training Exchange system, the Prescribed Fire Training Center based out of Florida that's expanding. I mean, these are just great opportunities to invest in to give more training opportunities for, not that I want to say the non-traditional workforce, but the folks who just aren't necessarily typically first in line for those training opportunities. So key takeaways, no single solution. Recommendations as you read through this, some of these just need somebody to make a decision. Some of these will actually require an act of Congress. Some of these may be more transformational where, we do actually recommend creating an entire new organization. So there's a lot of different styles of recommendations in this report. We did not officially label them as actionable, providing direction, or transformational, but if you keep that framework in mind as you read through the report, you'll figure out which one's which. Short and long term, again, immediate, some of them are going to take a lot longer to work through. And our guidance, our statute, our clear direction was largely focused on congressional action. But again, there's things in here that can empower NGOs, that can empower fire departments and districts, that can empower state forestry divisions. There's lots of opportunities in here that are not just directed at Congress. And like I said, sometimes there's a bit of a breadcrumb trail that isn't necessarily as, in the bold font in the headline there. But if you get into the details, you'll see it where we put it in there. So next steps for the commission. Obviously, we have these audiences in Congress. So we've got these committees in the Senate and the House that we've been working with. When we released the report in late September of last year, in early October, commission members went to DC and had a bunch of meetings, kind of did a barnstorming tour of meetings. And we actually had an incredible representation from the House Wildfire Caucus the same day that they were voting on a new speaker. So, they easily could have blown us off and said, this is way more important. We have to vote for a speaker. But we had, I think, about 8 members of that caucus in the room at one time. So I think we're getting really good traction from elected officials working through this. And so how are we kind of tracking this? It's been an interesting process. We went through this robust consensus-based process of work groups and full commission members. Then we finalized the report, and there was zero consensus moving forward on each individual running to their elected officials, to their networks, and we're trying to track this the best we can. And so Annie and Tyson have this legislative action tracking spreadsheet. So there's specific offices, there's specific groups. There's the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, WIFLC, is looking at kind of taking ownership of a few of these. National Association of State Foresters has at least 13 of the recommendations that they're looking at moving forward through policy action. And so overall, we're seeing about 50 of the 148 recommendations currently have some sort of traction. It might be really solid, or it could just be in the discussion stage at this point. But I think I'm pretty excited that here we are just a few months after the report was released, and about a third of them have a path forward right now. And it's tough. We would like people talk about, we need a comprehensive bill to move this whole thing as is forward. And I would love that, but I just don't know how realistic that is considering the variability of who needs to take action on these recommendations. And again, some of these aren't really going to be solved by Congress. Um, and an example of that and the diversity of need in here really is the recommendation 94 that we just got into recently. So I am not an EMT or a paramedic. I'm kind of an oddball here. We've got an 8-person wildland fire management program, and a handful of us come from the conservation or just straight wildland world, and didn't come from the structure or EMS service world. And so some of this was news to me when I reached out to our network here in Northern Arizona in the early process, and I said, hey, we've got opportunities here to fix some things. What do we need to fix? And a handful of paramedics that support national incident management teams reached out to me and said, basically, when we cross state lines as a paramedic driving to an incident, I have a truck full of narcotics. I'm breaking quite a few laws. I'm going to a state where I may not be recognized as having the qualifications that I have back home in a formal way. We're implementing medical procedures in the field with very little oversight or documentation because there's no HIPAA process to securely say who we just treated with what and what are the next steps. So everybody is doing amazing things on fires. We're ramping up the amount of medical resources on fires. We're bringing them out for prescribed burns sometimes now too. And there's ways we can really make some changes to remove some of the risks people are taking and reduce the likelihood that there's folks out there who don't want to participate in wildland fire medical teams because of that risk. So we're going to expand the workforce if we can fix some of these challenges. So we got a call from a staff member from Congressman Josh Harder. They reached out to Annie and Tyson. Annie and Tyson said, hey, recommendation 94 that you're talking about, that came from Neil Chapman in Arizona. We'll connect with him. So then I reach out to my network of the folks that helped write this recommendation with me. We get on a call with the staffers. The staffers are now writing language with their legal staff, and they're going to move this forward. Basically, there was 3 things. We need to get qualifications recognized across state lines. We need to get the green light to take narcotics across state lines. And what was the third one? The third one was incident management teams, I believe, need to get better at kind of documenting their efforts when folks are working on medical calls on those fires. And so that's an example of what we're doing to move this thing forward. Elected officials grab onto a recommendation. The staffers are in place to point them to the right people. We help them clarify the details. They get their legal staff involved, and hopefully we'll see this in a bill somewhere soon. And so that gets into our next steps. Technically, the commission ends next month. The statute expires. The federal funding for the 2 staffers and their folks goes away. The funding to offset travel costs for commission members goes away. So very few commission members felt like we were ready to let this thing go. And so what we're trying to create is something we're calling a coalition approach. So there's at this final meeting next month, we're going to roll out some new ideas. And there's a couple groups that are looking to provide funding to make sure that Annie and Tyson stay in place to move this thing forward through the end of this year, which gives us some time to figure this out. And so if Annie and Tyson weren't in a position to do this, that congressional staff from Harder's office, who are they going to call to find out how do we move recommendation 94 forward? And so that's what we're hoping to keep together, is this coalition of commission members and some outside groups that may not have been directly appointed to the commission, and really continue with a new formation. I don't know what exactly we're going to call it, but the mission of this new group will be to move these recommendations forward. So we're really excited that although the official federal leadership of this is going to expire, we're well positioned to keep the momentum moving forward, even without the feds funding and leading the effort. So that's what I had. Happy to dive into some questions. I see a few things in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. That was awesome. Way to cover a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. I really liked the arc that you painted for us. So really appreciate that. I think the breadcrumb and connective tissue that you kind of left with was, obviously really important and timely. Yeah, we've had some activity in the chat, and so just going through one of the ones from Mark is is enabling beneficial fire a more nuanced way of approaching things that were formerly called, quote, let it burn policies? Seems like there needs to be political support and understanding built. And Mark, I saw you turn your camera on, so if you want to add to that, please unmute. Otherwise, we'll let Neil tackle it.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of really cool social science coming out of the Ecological Restoration Institute at Northern Arizona University School of Forestry here, and I feel like you're right. There's this nuanced kind of dialogue taking place around what do we call this thing? You know, it's a wildfire under federal rules. We're operating under these guidelines and agreements and compacts associated with wildfire, but it's suddenly doing something desirable. and so does the public know that? How do we communicate that? We're still spending a bunch of money on a wildfire, but it's not destroying things, it's helping things. And so I think one of the trends I'm seeing with the research coming in around the public's view of some of these things is, I think the line is starting to blur in whether it's prescribed fire or beneficial wildfire in a way that the public just wants to know, is it good or bad? Is it doing things I should be worried about, or is it doing things I should be thankful for? And I don't know, we're certainly not there yet, but I think that the public is starting to understand through some really powerful messaging that when we tell them the truth, we don't want to lie to them, but we tell them the truth that this is a wildfire that started from a lightning strike that's being managed to protect our communities and restore our landscapes. We're seeing great acceptance of that. There's obviously a vocal component out there of folks who don't want us to be doing that sort of management strategy. But I understand that. I want to have those conversations with folks because it's it's tough. It's easy to say this is a new discipline, but it's not. I feel like people have been doing this, especially in New Mexico, on the Gila for a long time. And so we need to get better at communicating. We need to get better internally at communicating as well, and figuring out how we can break down some of these acceptance barriers. So it is, it's tough. I think the Forest Service would, if they were here, say we don't have a let burn policy for anything. Just like the term managed fire, there is no unmanaged fire. We obviously, when we're aware of a fire, we're doing something about it, and that management decision might be back off in a way due to safety or ability to do beneficial fire. So it's complicated, and there needs to be some more political support. I think even internal to the Forest Service, there's some folks that don't like it. There needs to be a lot more empowerment. I mean, the ability to start going after pods, creating our operational boundaries ahead of time, creating our ARCI surveys ahead of time, doing all of these things. There's so much more than just putting the torch on the ground that day, that we need to be doing a better job to get these acres treated, whether it's prescribed fire or wildfire. So yeah, I think I rambled for a bit there, but did you have anything else, Mark?
Well, it introduces a lot more complexity, which, sometimes people don't like that when they already feel like they have enough complexity. We have decades of Smokey Bear telling us to think about fire in a certain way. Maybe there needs to be a new Smokey Bear campaign that talks about beneficial fire, that creative folks could start to, offer a different message.
Correct. I see Caggiano jumping into the chat there. He actually led a session on pods. So pods would be potential operational delineations. It's basically, for example, we have a wildfire start somewhere and we start prepping a road system to either burn off or stop the wildfire when it gets there. Pods, in my mind, is we don't do it when the wildfire starts. We start doing it now. So it's an agreed upon, collaboratively developed framework of fire control features. And you're right, the complexity around how we talk about this internally and externally is evolving sometimes faster than I think we're ready for. I think a lot of us joke it's time for Smokey Bear to retire and have a new qualification come in behind him. And but at the same time, that message of we don't want the public starting wildfires. I mean, the majority of our catastrophic fires are human started fires, at least in northern Arizona. The expensive ones were all human starts. So we've got to balance that with still getting people that stop doing stupid things out in the woods, with kind of letting them know that you know, fire is really a beneficial tool in the landscape. We just don't want it when it's an unexpected red flag day kind of event.
Yeah, appreciate that question. And Neil, I'll go back to your slide about collaboration and how important collaboration is in the landscapes where people might be working. And I think that's another place, Mark, where the social acceptance and just awareness about that not every fire is bad and there are options when wildfires start. Can go a long way to enabling more beneficial fire. But there are a couple other things in the chat that I want to hit on. And one of them is from Haley Dunn, who says, is there a publicly accessible version of the legislative action tracker? Which actually I asked Neil the same question yesterday when we were prepping for this. And so I kind of know the answer, but Neil, do you want to speak to Haley's question?
The current shared document is behind a firewall site that the feds are using on FireNet, but send me, that's why I put my email in the chat, send me an email and I will forward you the most recent one.
Wow, awesome. That's generous.
Yep.
Thank you. So yeah, check the chat for Neil's email. And thanks for defining potential operational delineations. Every acronym that you say without explaining it, you know, requires putting $1 in the jar or something like that. So we do have a question from Mike Caggiano. Neil, can you speak to recommendation number 59? Assuming you can just recall number 59 off the top of your head. He put in Congress should examine whether the Farm Service Agency and NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service programs, can be used to compensate producers for forage losses due to beneficial fire to reduce the threat of catastrophic wildfire. So you can read that there.
Yep. So that was again, a wonderful conversation. The rancher representative on the group from Southeast Oregon was just wonderful because he basically, again, kind of like the EPA, where they're like, we need to make sure we're protecting air quality standards, but we're recognizing we need to do more prescribed fire, beneficial fire. The ranchers basically were saying the same thing. We want to enable more beneficial fire on the landscape, but here's how it kicks us in the butt sometimes. And so this is a bottleneck to getting support to expand the use of fire. And so right now, the reality is for some folks, if there's a beneficial fire opportunity, they have to assess what are the grazing impacts if it's inside an allotment. Is this a current allotment? Is this something that we're going to do a big enough burn? I mean, we just had a still fire last fall here in Flagstaff, 12,000 acres of a beneficial wildfire. That is a full allotment in some places. Other places, it could be a corner of an allotment. And so really making sure that we're not going out there and just saying we want to drop fire everywhere on the landscape and have no consequences from that. We're saying that as we're expanding the use of fire, we're potentially burning up forage that people were planning on using. And so how can we make sure that we're appropriately integrating them, not just in a compensation process, but in the entire integration of decision support tools. But that was something they brought up that was a real thing where they're saying it's going to be hard for you know, your agricultural partners to support some of these issues if you can't come to the table and talk about the ways it impacts us. And I think that's the background on this one, where can we have a pot of money if especially on federal land where we want to roll into a scenario that involves burning up a significant part of somebody's allotment, and just instead of saying sorry dudes, we can actually say, hey, we recognize the impact, we recognize the need, and we want to make sure we're making things right for everybody involved, whether it's saying we're going to go out and give air purifiers to people getting smoke, or we're going to go out and financially compensate ranchers after burning up their grazing areas that we've agreed upon they have access to. So yeah, long-term forage quality is likely to improve, just requires a bit of patience. Exactly. And so that's again where these subtle things where you don't have this language saying stop burning up my grass. They're saying I understand the benefits of this, but here's an impact that we want to talk about.
Yeah, great. So another question for Neil. How how do you think the final recommendations in the report may have been different had Congress not been your target audience? But given that Congress was your target audience, how can fire managers and practitioners and all of us here determine which recommendations are most actionable for them, for their own work?
That's the first time I've had this question. So considering 10 seconds of thinking about this, I'm not sure, because at the same time it's almost like we have a mix of kind of top down, bottom up here. And obviously top down starts with Congress and the federal agencies, and a robust federal fire workforce is incredibly important for many Western communities. And so, even if we were sort of turned this report on its head, I think some of these things we would still come to the same conclusions. Because even if we're just thinking about, how do we make sure the city of Flagstaff is protected? Obviously, we're surrounded by Forest Service land, so we're going to have to go to Congress and talk about our Fed workforce and Fed policies. But I think if our audience wasn't Congress, there may have been opportunities to get more emphasis around non-Fed programs. So whether it's, empowering the non-Fed workforce a little more, we would have just had the ability to maybe put in some recommendations in there that I wouldn't say that were dropped because of the capacity that was already in there, but maybe just had a little more time and space and mental capacity to plug into some of the local issues that are driven by municipal and NGO and state level organizations. So rather than giving them breadcrumbs, we would just throw it out there in bold letters. And so I think that's one of the things we're excited about moving out of the federal statute, because there were some limitations in sort of our ability to hammer on certain topics, because again, our audience was Congress. So I
Yeah,
would hope
no.
that, moving forward, you'll potentially see some less Fed heavy progress.
Yeah, well, I think your illustration of the paramedic EMT situation perfectly illustrates why a coalition is needed, because if we lose all the brain trust of the commission, and we lose all that work because of a deadline or the end of certain funding for Tyson and Annie, it's going to be really rough to revive it and to reconnect the brain trust. So I would say given that the commission is kind of like ending and the coalition concept is beginning. And there was a question in the chat about the legislative tracking sheet. And obviously, like you said, not everything's, needs legislation. What are the top 3 things that this future nascent coalition is gonna, you see them doing in the next 8 months?
I don't know the exact status of kind of the tribal sovereignty work that Bill Tripp is leading, but again, recognizing some of the cultural changes that need to happen that may not be at the scale of solving the wildfire crisis, but the really important components of revitalizing our national relationship with fire and transitioning from kind of the fire is the enemy to fire is our tool, to people can do this without $5,000 worth of gear on their back, and we don't need helicopters and fixed wing aircraft for everything, and really restoring kind of the community ownership of fire and stealing fire back from the feds. I think the work that Bill Tripp is doing, again, getting into kind of Amanda's question there a little bit too, in the next couple of years, I don't know the likelihood or status of those things, but man, I think those are some of the most important components to moving our national narrative from fire is the enemy to fire is the beneficial solution. I think that's so important in this national situation. And then we, even with like what Nate was saying about resource orders and payments from the feds to support for prescribed fire, I think that is moving forward. We're having conversations at the state level right now on how that can happen. The feds, I think, are in a good position. A couple of years ago, there was something called the Fire Funding Fix that set up. Unfortunately, I think it's expiring soon, which is scary. But the reality that if the federal fire budget for the Forest Service is fully utilized, they're not going to pull money from existing programs to backfill that need. I think we can have a similar solution for prescribed fire funding, and that's where we don't need to put all of this pressure on the Forest Service or on the BLM or all on other land management agencies. We have this giant component of the response workforce. I mean, again, you show up, we get ordered, we show up in California with a truck full of people and we don't know who else is there. And we get there and there's a whole camp built for us and we get to work. And none of that stuff is really being done for prescribed fire. So can we use that same sense of urgency and get acres treated under that same framework? Mobilize some contractors, mobilize us. Let's do these things in our backyard. I think the workforce especially will expand. We've got a lot of firefighters in Flagstaff that don't want to be available to sleep in the dirt for 2 weeks in California. And maybe that's why they left the suppression world and joined the structure world, because they don't want to be gone for 6 months just to earn a decent living. They'll do all kinds of things here locally. And so the number of people in our department participating in prescribed fire activities would double if they know they can do it here locally and they don't have to travel somewhere. So I think engaging that local workforce in the implementation, in the training. I mean, was in Texas on a wildfire assignment a couple years ago. There was not a federal person for quite a ways. And yet we still had fires burning down homes. We still have a fuels problem. Fixing the federal workforce is not going to solve a thing in Central Texas. So the reality is there's so much of our workforce we need to work on that is not federal. And I think that's something we're seeing some great intentions coming out of the fire administration. As we're doing some presentations with fire chiefs and fire districts associations, there's a lot of interest there. And I think that the feds value that conversation where we're saying, we don't need you to go hire 100 new people on the forest to be able to do what we're asking you to do. You can just pull from this existing framework of agreements and resources and use these people to scale up your prescribed fire program.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of opportunities, and it's exciting to have the report live and now to be rolling into a new phase. So here's a question on smoke management. Did the report's recommendations on smoke management account for different vulnerabilities in different communities? And I guess regardless of whether it was accounted for in the report, like how can we as a community integrate those into smoke planning? So not every community is handles smoke the same way. Some populations are more vulnerable or susceptible to illness.
We had so the commission makeup included a woman who works for an NGO whose specific role was there to make sure that community equity was factored into all of our decision making. And so that was a really powerful position where, again, this almost applies to every single work group. It wasn't just one group, but that's a real thing. You look at, I'll just use our Flagstaff as an example. We have not as many homes in Flagstaff that have air conditioning, especially the older ones, where a lot of the more modern homes, especially the very fancy gated communities, they have super robust HVAC systems. They have incredibly well-sealed homes. They've got a 4-inch thick filter in their furnace, air filter, that you can easily stick a HEPA rated filter in there and turn on your AC and have fairly clean air inside your house during pretty much any sort of smoke impact. But a lot of our folks in Flagstaff open their windows at night and put the fans on because, that's how we keep our houses cool, and we don't have air conditioning. And so that's a whole different crisis, and it gets into equity. And so we are really trying within the city to commit resources to indoor air quality. So as we're advocating for more beneficial fire, we're owning up that we're saying smoke. And so we've been able to secure funding and distribute over 200 filters, and kind of stealing your Forest Stewards Guild model. of a loaner program. We built this during COVID, and so we just went straight to a donation program because there was this, we can't be interacting with people during COVID. So and that's kind of worked out really well for us. So we've given out 200 of medium room size air filters. Our sustainability division just got an EPA grant to retrofit certain buildings, city buildings, a couple community centers to make them basically what we're calling clean air hubs. And I think they're even working on some sort of mobile facility that it's like a giant RV of some sort that will basically be like some sort of resilience, hub of some sort where they'll have clean air, they'll have showers, they're basically building like a mobile center, response center for people when there's when our forest closes because of a wildfire. We have people living in the forest that now are kicked out. They need a place to go. They need a place to be taken care of, and shelters can't absorb all of that. So we're really trying to look at how our community can be fire adapted, not just at that landscape level, not even at like the home level, but inside your home level, inside facilities. And so I think that's an emerging trend that we need to see more communities adopting, that we as advocates for beneficial fire need to be doing a better job at securing resources. And another thing that we asked recently was, when there's a big wildfire and that budget code opens up for ordering, could we order a couple hundred air filters and target people in those areas where the smoke is going? And the question there is like, probably, but nobody's doing it. So somebody's got to do it first to create the culture and the expectation that that's what we do. So I think there's a lot of tools. I mean, there's DIY indoor air filters from a box fan and things you can get at Home Depot for under $50. So there's a lot of outreach and education we need to do around the equity of the smoke impacts.
Yeah, no, great answer. You need capacity though to access an EPA grant.
Yep.
And so it's great that Flagstaff's doing that. And I love you amping up our small HEPA filter loan program here, which I should, in full disclosure, say Porfirio and I borrowed from Bill Tripp and the Karuk tribe in Northern California. So, good ideas get passed around. We have a new question here from Katie. I work in ag soil health, not fire, so please feel free to adjust this question as necessary. What's your sense of whether local state governments are moving toward requiring defensible space around existing homes in the WUI? So this is a WUI question, a zoning implication question.
Yep, it is the hot topic. And so it's not like anything that we're talking about here is old and stale, but I would say the thing in the last 6 months that is really becoming a much more common discussion, especially amongst our community risk reduction division, is codes enforcement, WUI risk. And so a couple thoughts. One, there's a podcast called All Things Wildfire, and there's a recent interview with Frank Freivault, retired chief from Mammoth Fire in California, who's now heading up the Cal Poly WUI Fire Institute. His mind's in a really cool space on some of these challenges. Nancy Watkins is an actuarial with insurance companies in California. She's got an amazing podcast in there talking about this stuff. And so when we in the hallway of the fire department, we talk about carrots and sticks. And so what can we do to provide a carrot? When do we need the stick? And that then gets into what neighborhood are we talking about? Because I think some of the social science here comes in huge. In urban areas, codes are fairly acceptable, and they're really important because in some of these catastrophic fires like Marshall Fire, Camp Fire, some of the science is showing that the most likely way that your house is going to catch on fire is your neighbor's house on fire. And if that neighbor's house has really robust defensible space, then your house is much less likely to burn down. And so if we get 1 home out of 10 doing really robust defensible space, well, are we really making a difference? And so, yes, we're making a difference for that one parcel to increase their likelihood, but it needs to be a lot bigger than that. And so I think we're starting to see both a recognition by insurance companies of this kind of chaotic risk that is very hard to assess and measure and price. And And that chaos is kind of the canary in the coal mine. There's going to be issues if large amounts of communities suddenly can't get insurance. In a lot of our rural areas around the West, we already have housing crisis issues. We already have incredibly high housing costs in places like Flagstaff. And so now we're seeing the reality that you can actually save up enough to put a down payment to get a mortgage for a house that you're going to pay half your income for, but now you can't get insurance. That is going to be a nightmare. And then Frank Freivalt brought up something amazing that, this is like what I mean, where the impacts of this situation are just starting to scratch the surface. Our municipal bonding, our fire district bonding, our school district bonding is based on property taxes. And if enough homes are not eligible for regularly priced insurance, property tax numbers might be going down, and the ability to bond is going to get harder and more expensive. So literally the ability for a fire district to go out and float a bond to build a new fire station might be harder because of fire risk. And so the ability for us to make sure we're doing both the carrot and stick approach, and in rural areas, the stick approach is going to be really hard to get a county to enforce a robust WUI code in an incredibly rural area. Probably isn't going to happen. But those people in those areas are probably really well empowered to work together to do the carrot approach. So whether they're helping each other, whether it's areas' ability to go get grants to help offset some of these costs. So I think we're really trying to develop different approaches for different communities. But City of Flagstaff has an incredibly robust WUI code. We're going to go through updating that again in the next year. And you see it. You go through the neighborhoods that have been built post WUI code, and it's really hard to ever imagine a conflagration running through that area. Where you go into the older neighborhoods and it's like, hey, you know what? The forest around that neighborhood is fine. We've done the treatments. Red flag day, fire is going to stay on the ground, but we're going to lose 20 homes in a half an hour. So it's tough on how we retrofit. A lot of communities, and I'm sure it's the same for you guys in New Mexico there. We're moving federal funds to the state, to our local areas on hazardous fuel reductions really well. So we're getting almost 100 grand a year in grants where we can go to homeowners, say, we're going to give you 80% of the cost per acre to reduce your hazardous fuels. None of that money can go to doing any retrofitting on their structure, any home hardening. That's all FEMA money, and FEMA grants are incredibly difficult to deal with. Where state forestry grants, we move those things left and right. So that came up in the commission space. It was really tough. We had to have a chat with FEMA. I remember specifically saying, I get anxiety going to your website, never mind trying to download applications, and we've got to fix that.
Yeah, it's a wicked problem because, when we think of wildfire, we think of our land management agencies, and they are moving lots of money and doing lots of treatments, but it stops at the structure. We have to look to Homeland Security and FEMA for retrofitting structures, for making them more ember resilient, and that is a real challenge. A lot of capacity is needed there, or a lot of changes to how they structure their programs. I think this conversation that we landed on from Katie's question is actually really great because our whole private insurance market is being challenged by climate change. And that's happening around the world, and obviously happening in the wildfire space. As a nation, we've already made a decision to have some sort of like flooding and hurricane insurance for the uninsurable. I haven't heard conversations about that in the wildfire space. That's going to be some tough conversations. But there are, as a country, we've navigated that to keep people in places that flood regularly and to keep people on the path of hurricanes with some stability in their lives. And, so as a country, we have to have that conversation in the context of wildfire.
I think one of the big things we need to be doing about defensible space and codes is we need more state level leaders looking to come to an agreeable terms around what are the mitigations that matter. How do we monitor that those mitigations have been completed and maintained? And then how do we create incentives for those homeowners? And so this was a framework that Frank Freivault was just walking us through the other day. Because if we know there's lots of mitigations we can do. You can go online and type wildfire risk reduction and find all kinds of NFPA or wildfire prepared home from IBHS. There's fuel, there's construction, there's all kinds of things that you can learn about. But if we don't have an agreed upon framework of what are the mitigations that matter, it's going to be really hard for us to create some sort of standardized process in our communities to provide similar recommendations to then assess where they completed, and then basically add some sort of benefit to the homeowner where, you just spent 20 grand on fuel reduction and home hardening. What's your actual benefit besides, your actual wildfire risk reduction? Is the insurance company allowed to value what you've done and price you accordingly? Because at the state levels of insurance, if you don't have an agreed upon metric of efforts, then that insurance company can't come in and say, well, we're going to give you a 10% discount because you don't have vegetation within 5 feet of your house. We need these, at a minimum, state level guidelines that allow the insurance companies to actually value these mitigation efforts.
Yeah. Another wicked problem in a ball of wicked problems.
Yes.
Yeah, and I want to thank Rachel for helping everyone in the chat and helping with Zoom. And she has a message here in the chat and a reminder again of how to access. And I want to thank Nathan Miller from the city of Santa Fe for chiming in and for putting those links in. Sounds like we're winding down in terms of like questions in the chat. And of course, I want to thank Neil for your time today, your preparation, and all the service you did being on the commission. I'm sure that year when the commission was running hot was just, a big year in your work life and your personal life. So appreciate you doing that and contributing.
Thank you. And thank you to the Forest Stewards Guild for setting this up and for the great work you guys do all over the country.
Yeah, no, thank you. Okay, well, with that, everyone, we'll send you off back to your non-Zoom life, and hopefully we'll do something again, and maybe we'll catch up with Neil and find out what's up with the coalition, and we'll have another conversation in a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.